Thank you all for joining us. I'm Karen Eggleston, Director of the Asia Health Policy Program at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in our series of seminars this spring quarter, which we'll be holding as webinars. We hope in these unusual circumstances that you and yours are healthy and well. Before introducing today's special guest speakers, I'll talk a little bit about forthcoming events and webinars at our center. This talk is the third in a series of the Asia Pacific Research Center on COVID-19 in Asia. We'll have another one next week on the virus in the South China Sea. And then on May 15th, back-to-back on economic impact in China and bilateral relations. And a final on May 27th about South and Southeast Asia. So we invite you to look at our website if you're interested in any of those in this series. There also will be every 2 weeks Asia Health Policy Program seminar. So 2 weeks from now, a topic that is reminding us that there are other things besides COVID-19 and related to it going on. That'll be topics in health policy in Korea and China on May 13th at noon, talking about obesity and diabetes in Korea and physician-patient tensions in China with visiting scholars from those two countries. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our special guests for a discussion between Matthew Kohrman and Gan Quan, who are co-editors of the book, Poisonous Pandas, Chinese Cigarette Manufacturing and Critical Historical Perspectives. Dr. Gan Quan is Director of Tobacco Control of the International Union Against Tuberculosis and Lung Disease. His research tackles various topics pertaining to tobacco control in China, and we're delighted he's able to share his expertise on that topic with us today. Discussion will be launched and the dialogue undertaken by my colleague Matthew Kohrman, who is an associate professor in Stanford's Department of Anthropology and senior professor here at FSI Asia Pacific Research Center. His research brings anthropological methods to bear on the ways health, culture, and politics are interrelated. So now I'll turn it over to Professor Kohrman. Please input your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll get to those questions in the last 10 or 15 minutes. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, everyone who's joining us. I want to thank APARC, the Asia Pacific Area Research Center at Stanford, which is part of the Freeman Spogli Institute, for hosting this event. So our thinking in setting up this webinar was to provide everybody an opportunity to think with us about the intersection of tobacco and COVID-19, and with a special focus given to China, an area where I've worked for some 20 plus years, and my colleague Gan Quan, who has worked for a similar amount of time. So we're going to have a conversation between the two of us. I'll be posing some questions. Dr. Gan will be posing some questions to me, and then we'll try to have some time at the end to respond to audience questions. Before we get there, though, it came to our attention in prepping for this presentation that likely many of our listeners, many of those like you who are tuning in for this event, currently know much, much more about COVID-19 than you do about tobacco. And that makes sense, and it also makes sense that COVID-19 is at the forefront of your thinking. So if we're going to talk about this double pandemic, it struck Dr. Gan and me that it would be useful for us to ever so briefly provide our listeners a relatively brief overview of the tobacco pandemic. I'll be moving through these relatively quickly, and apologies for those who know this very well, and apologies for those who don't and who feel like I'm going too quickly. So tobacco is very much a pandemic. Many don't initially think of it as so, or those who do think of tobacco as a pandemic think of it as yesterday's problem. They think of it as something that we've largely solved, and that has very much to do with many of our immediate experiences living in parts of the world where truly cigarette smoking is not that common in our kind of immediate quarters. However, this vision of yesterday's problem is problematic. It draws from largely a US-based set of epidemiological findings about tobacco. We can see here that tobacco grew quite dramatically in this kind of visualization from the 1900s. We're talking about cigarette consumption here. Cigarette consumption grew quite dramatically from the early 1900s, peaking around the 1960s or 1970s, and then starting a decline. This is regularly portrayed in more triumphant sort of representations like this, with depicting falling rates of cigarette consumption. But note that this is in the United States, where we're down to about 10, 12, 13% right now. So this triumphalism doesn't really square with what we know is happening worldwide. And the story worldwide is one of continuing cigarette consumption and growing cigarette consumption from the early 1900s to the present day. And if you look at this image, you'll see that to the right, that since the 1960s, since we've been told that cigarette consumption has peaked in parts of the world like the United States, worldwide cigarette consumption from the 1960s to 2010 has hardly peaked. It's actually gone up threefold. So we've seen a tripling from 1960 to 2010 in terms of global cigarette consumption. And what we've also seen is that there's been a significant expansion of cigarette consumption, tobacco exposure around the world, such that today the majority of people who are exposed to cigarette smoke worldwide and who are consuming cigarettes are in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Over 65% are in those parts of the world. Now, that's not just by happenstance. Cigarette consumption, the pandemic of tobacco, is very much a man-made problem, and it's very much a industrial and corporate problem. And the expansion of cigarettes and the production and consumption of cigarettes globally since the 1960s has had very much to do with the aggressive behavior of big tobacco corporations like British American Tobacco in Africa, very much so due to corporations like Philip Morris International and their aggressive expansion around the world, notably in areas like Indonesia, but not exclusive to Indonesia. And also very much so the global expansion of this, what could have thought of as an epidemic in the early 1900s to a pandemic, has had very much to do with the expansion of cigarette production and consumption in China. With this image, you'll see that cigarette consumption has gone up. This is actually annual cigarette production, and the production has very much tracked with consumption rates, in large part because this is one of those situations where supply very much dictates demand. And we've seen an expansion. This is in billions of sticks of tobacco going up from the early 1900s through the mid-19 to 1952. This graph is from 1952 to 2010. There was a modest drop-off in 2016, notably because of a long sought-after tax increase pushed by public health advocates in China. And after that tax increase occurred, there was a drop, much as predicted by health economists, in terms of the consumption, and producers reduced their production, but it's just stayed pretty level since then. The global cigarette market today is dominated by the big five: Philip Morris, British American Tobacco, Japan Tobacco, Imperial, and most notably the China National Tobacco Corporation, which today makes about 40% of all cigarettes in the world. So we've been hearing a lot about curves in the last few weeks, flattening curves. This is our mission around the world. This is why we are in shelter-in-place situations. The notion of flattening a curve is very much specific to contagious disease. When you're talking about something like tobacco, non-contagious disease formation, you're not really talking about flattening a curve. So this is consumption rates by region in different parts of the world. The top line is the Americas, the second line is Europe. We have notably seen a reduction of consumption rates in those parts of the world, which if this was COVID-19, everybody would be feeling very happy and heroic about. The rest of the world has seen a relatively set of flat lines. None of this is actually good news when it comes to tobacco. These are all signs overall that tobacco continues to be a profound problem worldwide. We've been hearing a lot in the last few years about vape technologies. We know that they have been growing in distribution and use. And quite notably, they've been utilized most significantly in just those parts of the world where cigarette consumption has gone down. So we've been seeing these technologies replacing very much. So people are continuing to be exposed to tobacco just in different forms. So why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care because tobacco is profoundly toxic when ingested, when brought into the lungs. Tobacco is today the #1 cause of preventable death in the world. I repeat that, it's the #1 cause of preventable death in the world. More people today die of tobacco exposure than any other preventable cause. And this is growing dramatically. So if in the 20th century, 100 million people died of tobacco, which we know now from very careful epidemiological work, the projections for what we're facing in this century are extraordinary. We're expecting a 10-fold increase to 1 billion people dying of tobacco exposure in the 21st century. This is hardly the kind of heroic notion of flattening a curve that we're looking for today with COVID. Who's dying and who's likely to be dying? Well, this has a lot to do with who's consuming cigarettes. And one of the few features of the demographics of tobacco that I should note is that far more men are consuming cigarettes worldwide on a daily basis than women. And as a consequence, approximately a third of the male adult global population are smoking today, and they will be bearing the direct brunt of the mortality and morbidity in years to come, and their family members will be burdened by those diseases. So there's been a lot of hope and around tobacco control efforts. Tobacco control is not a new phenomenon. It's been around for hundreds of years. But at the end of the last millennium, at the end of the 1900s, there was a lot of hope around a very modern form of tobacco control built up by the World Health Organization and its Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And many of us are still hopeful that there will be significant gains from this Framework Convention. But there have been notable areas where this has not been the case. And in the volume that Professor Gan and I co-edited with some other colleagues that came out recently, Poisonous Pandas, one of the key findings of our volume was that the framework convention on tobacco control has not succeeded in China. And that's largely due to the double addiction that is nicotine and taxes, as well as profound industry interference in China, tobacco industry interference with public health efforts to control tobacco. So now enter COVID-19, the double pandemic. So I'm going to just say a very few words about this before I start a conversation with Dr. Gan. What I'd like to note is that there's a lot we still don't know about COVID-19. Some of what we do know is that mortality rates from COVID-19 are amplified by pre-existing conditions, such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic respiratory diseases, and cancer. Something we've also seen in the preliminary epidemiological data is that men are dying of COVID-19 at higher rates than women. A lot of women are dying, a lot of men are dying, and it would seem like, from what we know, that more men are dying than women. So this is some data from countries spanning from France to Iran, to Italy, to Denmark, to China, to Spain. Now, as a consequence of those epidemiological features, there's been quite a bit of hypothesis done on why is it that men are dying of COVID-19 more than women, and why is it that these various, what role do these various pre-existing conditions play, and where are they coming from? And as many of you have seen, many of the hypotheses turn to cigarette smoking. What we do know is cigarette smoking is a profound risk factor for a variety of cancers and a variety of chronic diseases, many of them that map on directly to what we know are the pre-existing conditions that amplify COVID-19 mortality. And what we also know, this is circling back, is that tobacco consumption is something that is a global phenomenon. It is high in many parts of the world still, from Chile to Indonesia to the former Soviet Republic to many parts of Western Europe, and still significantly high in the United States, and still quite high in places like China. So the WHO has already begun to put out public service announcements to try to tackle what many public health people acknowledge as a double pandemic that's amplifying one another. And we're starting to see these kinds of PSAs being released. Now, something else we're also seeing in the media is some competitive messaging, because there's been some peer-reviewed studies. There have also been a number of yet to be peer-reviewed studies that the initial findings have been released and then picked up by the media. And we've seen everything from headlines stating that coronavirus risks increased are increased as a consequence of smoking and vaping. But we've also seen headlines such as the one on the bottom right coming out of research done in France, questioning whether tobacco exposure, cigarette exposure, is a risk factor for COVID-19. And in fact, this one study out of France has actually suggested that nicotine consumption may be a preventative feature. So there are a lot of unknowns. There are a lot of questions to be raised. Now, what Dr. Gan and I want to turn to now is the question of how these two pandemics are affecting one another. In particular, how are they evolving in a part of the world that we know pretty well, which is China, and which we assume many of you in the audience are especially interested in. So with that, I want to end this PowerPoint and turn to a conversation with Dr. Gan. So Tren, welcome. It's really good to have you here. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule and coming to us from the East Coast, where you're based currently. So one of the first questions I want to pose to you is, what do you see, based on your perch as Director of Tobacco Control at the International Union for Tuberculosis and Lung Disease? What do you see, based on your work there? What do you see as the most important set of issues regarding this double pandemic, with special attention to China?
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Karen and Matthew, for the introduction, and especially thank you. I want to thank APARC Stanford for hosting this webinar. This is very difficult, unprecedented time for every one of us. I know COVID is probably on the top of mind of everybody. It's on the headline of every major newspaper, and that makes it even more significant for APARC to host this webinar to discuss this equally, maybe more important issue of tobacco control in China, which is we see it as the #1 public health issue in the world. So I think Matthew touched upon the mortality caused by COVID, and also the mortality caused by smoking a little bit, just to put things in perspective. Here in the US, I think the latest number of deaths from COVID is about 50,000. And the number of people killed by tobacco smoking in the US is about close to 500,000. So about 10 times difference.
Annually, right?
Annually.
Annually, yeah. We're annually about 500,000 people dying from cigarettes a year in the United States, yeah.
If you look at China, the contrast is even more drastic. So we know in China, less than 5,000 people have died from COVID. And every year, over 1 million people die from cigarette smoking. So it's about 200 to 300 times of difference. So, to answer your question, Matthew, for us who work in tobacco control full time, we recognize the disruption, the difficulties COVID has caused the entire world in public health, in economy, in livelihood. But we're really hoping when we return to the new normal, I don't think we are going to return to the old normal by any chance. When we return to the new normal, many measures will be taken, many things will change. And from our perspective, we have been thinking about how that will affect the work in tobacco control and maybe NCD, non-communicable disease control in general, which is really, like Matthew said, the #1 preventable risk factor for diseases and deaths in the world. How will we not lose focus on this very important issue post-COVID?
Okay, well, could you maybe lay out for our audience how COVID-19 is currently affecting the work of tobacco control in China, as you know it?
Yeah. I think I can talk about it from several perspectives. The first perspective is the impact on the people who work in tobacco control. Even though tobacco smoking is the #1 risk factor in China, 1 million people die from China. The work itself to control this epidemic has been severely underfunded and not prioritized. So if you look at China, as a nation, we probably have only less than 20 people working tobacco control at the national level, and very, very few people work on tobacco control at the subnational, provincial, city level. So extremely under-resourced. Because of the advent of COVID, and the entire government system needs to pivot to support, to counter this pandemic. And most of the public health people, including those working tobacco control, has been shifted to support COVID control. So that has caused anywhere between 4 months to 6 months delay in tobacco control work, obviously. So that's really one of the concern we have. And the second is we all know the economic impact of COVID on China and on US and on global economy. And the Chinese economy has shrunk for the first time since many decades ago. We know from past experience during Depression times that many economic sectors will be affected, but tobacco sector probably will be one of the least affected. So in the long term, we probably will see the revenue generated by the tobacco companies will be having an even bigger share of the central government's revenue, which is now about 6 to 7%. So that will probably make tobacco control advocacy even more challenging. As we know, the tobacco company not just contributing a certain share of the revenue to the government, but that also translates into the power they have in the tobacco control, in the policy making process.
Mm-hmm. So you're outlining a situation where this new pandemic, COVID-19, has dramatically undercut the work of tobacco control in China, which was woefully underfunded previously. Can you imagine any unexpected benefits to tobacco control coming out of this COVID-19 outbreak?
I think in general, I'm really hoping what has happened during the pandemic, COVID, the tragedy, will remind people how brittle or how a life is, and people will put more focus on how fragile life is. I think that's the proper word. How people will put more emphasis on, healthy lifestyle in general, and that would involve less smoking or quitting smoking, less drinking, healthy diet, more physical activities and things like that. When it comes to tobacco control, we now have about 10 studies coming out of China showing the link between the outcome or disease progression of COVID and smoking, mm-hmm. which has indicated, the studies have indicated that smokers have a higher risk of being admitted to ICU, being put on a ventilator, or even die from COVID In fact, I'm hoping there'll be more data coming out, and we have a solid conclusion which we can use to encourage people to quit smoking. I think these are probably the potential benefit we can see for tobacco control.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you, since you're talking about research, if you feel comfortable, could you summarize for us what you know about the kinds of research work that's coming out of China right now on COVID and tobacco? I think many of our listeners, our viewers, would be really interested in knowing some of what's coming out, what's in the works.
Yeah, I think up until now, there are mainly two research questions that have been looked at by researchers in China and also worldwide. The first research question is, if you get COVID, and how will your smoking status affect the outlook or the progression of disease down the road? So far, we have probably around anywhere between 12 to 15 studies around the world, and most of them are coming from China. The findings are quite consistent in the way that they indicate if you're a smoker, you are probably double your chance of being placed in ICU and ventilator and die from COVID. The second question is, which is trickier, is will your smoking status affect the chance of your being affected with COVID? And there's less evidence on that. Worldwide, we have seen probably around 5 to 6 studies, 2 from France and a couple from the US and 1 from China. And as you just showed, Matthew, in your presentation, the media story about one of the French studies is they had found with very preliminary evidence that nicotine might have a protective effect for one to being affected with COVID. We have been keeping a very close eye on the literature on smoking COVID, and we have looked into the methodology of each one of the studies that have looked at the second research question. And we have also voiced of concern on media as well. The main concern with these studies overall is, I think there are 2 limitations. One is the sample selection, whether that can be representative or correspondingly representative of the entire population. And secondly, a concern is the reporting of the smoking status by the patients themselves. Is very much a question. So I think overall, what I can say is the evidence with regard to smoking and COVID is very, very much preliminary from the epidemiological standpoint. If you look at the golden standard of epidemiological, any conclusion in epidemiology you need to have close to or random controlled trials, and also you need to explain the mechanism from the biological point of view. But we are far from that. So I guess when it comes to smoking and COVID, I really want to be err on the side of caution, at this point, especially given how enormous harm smoking poses among users. We know about anywhere between half to 2/3 of smokers are killed by the habit. So it's really there is never too late. Smoking, especially during the COVID, we know during lockdown everybody is staying in isolation, and that in a sense might be a good opportunity for people to to actually quit smoking, because we know, and for some people who try to quit smoking, one of the biggest factors that will lead to relapse smoking is the influence from their peers who smoke. Now in isolation, we are free of that influence, and hopefully some of the non-smoking family members can be helpful as well. So I think during COVID and after COVID, for the foreseeable future, our message for the government and for smokers is really being consistent with before, which is to quit the habit.
Okay. I'm going to ask maybe a couple more questions. Tren, you might have some questions for me, and then I want to remind our listeners that if you have questions, you can post them through the Q&A functionality of Zoom. So, Tren, as a keen observer of China, what can you tell us that you've seen beyond the conventional work of tobacco companies in China? So remind everybody that tobacco is a state monopoly in China. So it is a state. Tobacco companies in China are state-owned enterprises, and they're controlled at a national level by the State National Tobacco Corporation, otherwise known as the State Tobacco Monopoly Administration. Beyond the conventional work that those entities do, producing and marketing and distributing cigarettes to local shops, what can you tell us of what you've seen? What have they been doing in response to COVID-19?
Right. Maybe I can start at the global level very briefly. So we know the global market is dominated by several main tobacco companies, like Matthew just mentioned, Philip Morris, BAT, JTI, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of CSR activities going on. We call them corporate social responsibility activities, basically making donations to government, sometimes in form of cash, sometimes in the form of ventilators. We know this is the ultimate motivation is really to improve or maintain good relationship with government officials, so that in the long run, any policy making tobacco control will be in favor of tobacco companies. Similarly, in China, China Tobacco has been engaging in CSR activities as well. Some of us may recall in the 2008 earthquake, China Tobacco made a huge donation. I think one of the biggest donations by any entity to the earthquake relief. Similarly, during COVID, China Tobacco has made a sizable donation to poverty relief in China. But what I want to, I think that the observation here is, if you compare the CSR activities by China Tobacco and their international counterparts, the transnational tobacco companies, we really see more activities from the transnational tobacco compared to China Tobacco. And why is that? It's not. I don't think that's because China Tobacco is a good corporate entity with good behaviors. My interpretation is really the reason is, I think Matthew, you just touched upon that. In most other countries in the world, the tobacco company is a private industry. They have to lobby the government, and most of the times in the face of strong opposition from the tobacco control advocates, the civil societies. Whereas in China, China Tobacco is a monopoly. even though with some recent positive changes inside the government in tobacco control decision making, we still see China tobacco, the tobacco monopoly, being very much in the dominant position in tobacco control policy making. So in that sense, I would see there's a less strong a need for the tobacco company to engage in those kind of CSR activities to improve their relationship with the government, because they are already very much part of it. And so that's my observation. I know, Matthew, you have been this is something you are very much interested in following up for years. Any observation from your side that can be shared?
Oh, well, I mean, I have been trying to keep an eye on this as well, and I saw some numbers that were posted by, I believe the source was the China National Tobacco Corporation, and they were touting some of the spending that they were doing on in framing it in terms of COVID-19 response. And some of our colleagues at Tobacco Free Kids in Washington, D.C. did the work of going through that and adding it up. And I just want to make a comparison. Last year, 2019, the China National Tobacco Corporation did better than ever before in terms of profits and taxes generated for the Chinese state. Something in the order of $350 billion US. And someone at Tobacco Free Kids added up what they were able to glean from the reports of the spending that was being done to help promote COVID-19 prevention work in China. And it came to date, not 2% of those total earnings, but 2/100ths of 1%. 2/100ths of 1% of the total earnings from 2019 have been redirected by the China National Tobacco Corporation into some of this corporate responsibility spending efforts to help COVID-19. So whether it's because they're flat-footed, they're kind of incompetent in terms of the best practices of big tobacco, whether or not they just don't see a need, as you said, it's unclear to me, but it is a fraction.
Yeah, I think I think here the more important issue, the fundamental issue is really the government tobacco control public health policy making needs to be insulated from the influence of tobacco companies, and that's pretty much what is required by the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So any donation, any CSR activities from tobacco company needs to be banned outright, period, and that applies to China Tobacco as well. China Tobacco is incredibly profitable, like you just said, and how I'm sure this might be a question that some of the people in the audience might have. Since they're so incredibly profitable, is it okay for us to require them to donate some money in good causes? And the fundamental conflict of interest is one of the reasons. And second, there's really other mechanisms we can engage in to do that. Some countries have required tobacco companies to contribute compulsorily assessment from the tobacco products, like Vietnam, Bangladesh, 1% of tobacco revenue simply to the government, not in the form of CSR, but compulsory. So I think that can be used in China as well.
I was wondering, So I did some more digging in terms of numbers. Something you and I have questioned in the last few days in prepping for this webinar was, how are tobacco sales doing worldwide, and how are they doing in China? And what I've been able to glean is tobacco sales are doing remarkably well worldwide. Let's see. What we know is that British American Tobacco, the CEO stated, quote, "We believe there's no change in cigarette consumption pattern. Consumers continue to buy even in Italy. Shops are still open," unquote. Philip Morris International, the largest of the transnational corporations, saw a 6% growth in their first quarter of 2019 from last year, in 2020. First quarter growth in 2020 from last year. Now, the China National Tobacco Corporation, there was just some statistics released by the National Bureau of Statistics just 2 days ago on Monday for the first quarter of industrial growth, the statistics for industrial enterprises across China. So this is not just specific to tobacco. They released the stats for the first quarter for all sectors. And as one would expect, for the first quarter of 2020, industrial enterprises saw a significant drop in profits across the board, all sectors, up to 35%. So China has seen a first quarter drop of 35% in terms of profits for all industries. State-owned industries have borne the biggest brunt, 45%. Private enterprises say about 30%. And if you break this down by sector, some of them are really significantly hit. Automobile manufacturing, kind of no big surprise, hit hard, but hit how hard? 80% decrease in their profits from last year for the first quarter. Chemicals, electrical machinery, textiles, all hit really, really hard. Now, in terms of the Ministry of Finance in China, there have been two, and only two, bright spots in terms of industries in China for the first quarter of 2020. The first is the agriculture and sideline food processing industry has seen a 11% growth from last year. And maybe that's attributed to, a lot more city takeout food. I don't know, but who knows? The other bright spot, tobacco. The total profits from tobacco products across China has grown in the first quarter of 2020 from last year by 30%. They're making 30% more off of cigarette products in 2020 over the last few months, right smack in the middle of the outbreak than they did last year. So I think we have a lot of questions to ask about this double pandemic still.
Yeah, I think that underlines the challenge we're facing in tobacco control. Tobacco companies are becoming ever more profitable, ever more stronger even. The other thing I really want to touch upon is what is really fueling this increasing sale of tobacco products.
Yeah, what's your hypothesis, and then maybe we'll move to questions from the audience.
Yeah, I just want to one point I want to share, which is, we have 10-15 studies showing the more severe disease progression for smokers compared to non-smokers, and we have, maybe 1-2 study from France with severe limitations in their methodology, not peer reviewed, but despite of all of that, they are putting out a press release, and the tentative conclusions are really amplified by the media, and further amplified by social media. So, and that really led me to think about the power or the damage that can be created by this kind of misinformation during the this pandemic. And I think a lot of us are putting a lot of thinking into this issue, not just from the public health perspective, but from other perspectives as well. So yeah, just I think that's one of the factors that's really, I think, fueling this increase in tobacco sales that we somehow need to address.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gan. There are several questions coming in, if I might mention those.
Please.
One question, putting China in the broader context of other middle and low income countries, are there associations between the rate of economic development and the rate of increased smoking in LMICs?
Not quite. It's really a matter of the commitment that the government has shown in tackling this epidemic. We can give numerous examples of low and middle income countries with very low status of economic development, even from the low income group, where tobacco control has made big strides in the past decade, or so. So there's absolutely no correlation in that. It's a matter of how much commitment the leadership has put in tobacco control. And of course, on the other side, how strongly the tobacco industry has been opposing these measures.
Related to that, a question, Chinese celebrities have publicly campaigned against eating shark fin soup as well as eating endangered animals. Would an anti-smoking campaign by celebrities work in China? And what would be the reaction of the CNTC or CCP to that?
You mean using celebrities as ambassadors, as advocates for tobacco control? I think in general, that's a very good idea. I think I think WHO in China has been working very actively with a number of celebrities in China, as well as the China Association for Tobacco Control. They have worked with several celebrities in that. But what I want to emphasize in terms of public education is that certainly the role model played by these celebrities is very important. But also we have been very much emphasizing using high impact materials, striking images, videos. We really feel those kind of methods of communication can really have the biggest impact to show people vividly what tobacco smoking can do to their health and body.
Thank you. There's another question about research on the topic, a student writing a thesis. Would like to know if you know of good sources on CNTC and tax revenue. I'm sure poisonous pandas is one there, but also about interference in decision-making at central and local levels in public health. Do you have any recommendations of researchers or sources?
I definitely have the student look at poisonous pandas. There's a chapter co-authored by Chen, myself, and a couple of others that provides, I would arguably say, the best historical account of tobacco taxation, and with a really fat bibliography that would probably be really useful for the student. Interference, there are some very strong chapters at the end which lay out acts of interference. The Journal of Tobacco Control has also had some fine publications recently on this.
Yeah, I just want to add that I'll encourage the student to talk to some of the authors. Many of them have personal experience working in China and countering the interference from the tobacco industry. They have, I'm sure they have a lot more to share with you than what they can put into writing.
Another question, do you have any figures on percentage of medical expenditures in China devoted to treatment of tobacco caused or exacerbated conditions?
I don't have the exact figure off the top of my head. There's been quite a few studies estimating the economic costs from tobacco use in China, and majority of that cost coming from the treating the diseases caused by tobacco smoking. What I can say is that the economic cost from tobacco use is enormous. It's causing enormous burden to the Chinese economy, and there's been studies estimating that if you, for instance, raise tax and you can reduce the smoking prevalence to a certain extent, and how much money that can save for the Chinese government every year in the next 15 years, and that impact is really dramatic. And there's a pretty good body of literature that we can refer the person to if there's a need.
Thank you. Maybe some last set of questions in our last few minutes. If you could say a little bit what's known about trends among youths, young people in China in smoking. And also, as you know, there's research about whether people have enough information about the health impacts of smoking. Some would say even that some people overestimate the mortality rate from smoking, and many people, of course, underestimate that. What do we know about those trends in China?
So two questions, I guess. The first is about the youth. We have some national level surveillance data, representative of the national population about smoking status. What we have seen is there's very likely an increase in tobacco use among the youth group. And what I also want to say is we don't have very good data at the subnational level looking at, for instance, the metropolitan areas of Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, where likely we may be able to see even bigger increase in smoking among youth. Just by observation, I think we have seen that being picking up, and it's becoming more of a concern. The second question is about the...
Could I just jump in, Trent, on the first question? Haven't there also been some findings that that youth smoking is on the rise, has been on the rise for some time, and within that we're seeing relatively high rates of young women, girls, taking up cigarettes at rates much higher than, say, the national average of female smoking. To remind our participants, I showed a slide of the gender disparity of smoking in worldwide. In China, it's much more dramatic. In terms of female smoking, less than 2 or 3% of women, adult women, smoke cigarettes on a daily basis, while more than half of men do. So there's this profound disparity. But when you start to look at youth smoking, young women, girls are picking up cigarettes at much higher rates than just 2% of their peers.
Yeah, and also the potential underreporting. There is still somehow, some level of social stigma associated with women using tobacco. So there's this suspicion among researchers that probably there's significant underreporting among women about their true smoking status. And there's some preliminary research looking into that. And so we'll probably see that being published very soon.
Yeah, and the final question was about differences in education, wealth, income. We've seen a lot of disparities there around the world, and whether it's a question of if better educated people have more information and are less likely to smoke, Or do we see patterns like that? There have been trends in Korea, other parts of Asia, other parts of the world with that kind of a gradient. What do we know about China?
Well, what we do know in China is that the better educated and the wealthier tend to be better educated, are smoking cigarettes less than they were, say, 20 years ago. When you dig into the changing rates of cigarette consumption in China, what you see is that the declines that have been happening have been almost exclusively happening among the highly educated and well-off in China.
So it seems kind of interesting and somewhat contradictory trends that young people are better educated than previous cohorts, but taking up smoking now. Any final thoughts? We're at time. Thank you both so much.
So my final thought is that this is a conversation that has to continue. There's so much still unknown. We're at such a preliminary stage with COVID. On the other hand, we do know a lot about tobacco. And I would just say that I can't go into it, but tobacco is seen to be, by almost all observers, the consummate man-made public health catastrophe. And COVID has been represented very much as a kind of as a virus, and a virus that because of human error has been allowed out of the box. But I think actually there's probably a lot to be learned from tobacco research about how the virus in the first place was produced by a whole set of historical processes, everything by the encroachment of agriculture to transportation infrastructure to human, non-human contact. I just feel like we just need to know a lot more. And I think tobacco could actually serve the kind of historical work that's been done on tobacco could serve as a really good model for some of that.
I think very similar to what Matthew just said. If there's any progress we have made in tobacco control in the past 15 years, it's really because of the guidance of the global treaty on tobacco control, which is called Freeman Convention on Tobacco Control. So benefited from the vision of the WHO then General Director General, Dr. Brundtland. And what really makes this treaty special and or tobacco control work more effective is the collaboration from countries united under a common vision to address the common challenge from tobacco industry, which we see as a vector really of the disease caused by tobacco smoking. And there's a lot of information sharing. There's a lot of coordinated actions. And I think that really applies to COVID response as well. You know, I see a lot of concerns with cross-national collaboration in the context of COVID. But but the reality is we are living in an interconnected world. There's no way we can live in isolation from each other. And there's no way we can address this pandemic by working in isolation. And I think that's probably a very good lesson learned from tobacco control for COVID.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gan, Dr. Kohrman. Thank you all very much for joining us. Please stay healthy and resilient and join us in future Asia Health Policy Program webinars if interested. Thank you all.
Thank you.